Okay, good morning, everyone. I think it's a good time to start, and good afternoon to those, depending on where you are joining us from today. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this session on security risk management in the changing global and humanitarian context. My name is Lisa Riley, and I'm the Executive Director of GISF, the Global Interagency Security Forum. And I will say a bit more about GISF later for those of you who don't know us. It would be great to know who is joining us today, so do please introduce yourself in the chat. We're very pleased this year that for the first time, security risk management, and in particular integrating security risk management across humanitarian action, has been recognised as a priority topic here at HNPW. The objective of this session and the various other sessions under this theme throughout the next 3 weeks is to provide an overview of security risk management in the current global context for humanitarian response. The global context in which humanitarian action is implemented is changing, and despite growing concerns about the number of incidents affecting aid workers, there continues to be a gap in understanding around security risk management within the humanitarian sector. The tendency for siloing in our sector reduces the effectiveness of security risk management for sustaining safe access to populations in need. For security risk management to remain effective, it needs to continue to evolve and reflect the changes in global context and approaches to humanitarian action. For example, increased localization, changes in technology, etc. If we are going to achieve this, better communication across the sector is essential. This session will provide an opportunity to bring together different perspectives and to provide a broad understanding of the challenges and opportunities faced when developing and implementing effective and appropriate security risk management measures. So the agenda for this session today, following the introduction, we are very pleased to welcome our keynote speaker, Hugo, who will discuss current challenges within the humanitarian sector and where security risk management fits in. We'll then have a session looking at what security risk management looks like now and where it might go in the future. There's a short presentation and there will be a poll because we would really like your input into the discussions. And then a panel discussion with 3 great speakers. We have Fadi Halisso. Fadi is the CEO and co-founder of the NGO Basma and Zitona, an organization dedicated to support Syrian refugees and their hosting communities in Lebanon, Turkey and Iraq. We have Christine Persaud, who currently works as a consultant on risk, security and safeguarding leadership, and Fergus Thomas, who's a humanitarian advisor in the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And finally, in the session, we will invite you to join small breakout groups to get your ideas on how we can break the silos and make security more accessible across humanitarian action. As always at these events, there are some housekeeping rules. So the event will last 90 minutes. As I've said, do please introduce yourself in the chat. The plenary sessions of this event are being recorded and they will be added to the HNPW site for you to be able to view later. It is an interactive event, so we will be asking you to participate and the conversation will be much more interesting if you do. If you can please stay muted unless we ask you to unmute yourself, and that's particularly when we go into the breakout groups, do unmute yourself, and the same with your camera. If you can turn it on, but particularly when you go into the breakout groups, that will help encourage conversation. If you do have any technical questions or issues, please reach out to GISF Production in the chat and they should be able to help you. And finally, if you are interested, you can get an HPass badge for this event. Great. So a little bit about GISF. So we were formerly known as EISF. Some of you may have seen us from that. We went from the European Interagency Security Forum to global, last year. It's a member-led network. We currently have over 125 member organizations, as well as engaging with experts from the UN, academia, governments, and the private sector. We aim to drive positive change throughout the humanitarian sector through improving security risk management, looking at original research, collaboration, and events. And we hope with the primary objective of achieving safer and sustainable access to populations in need. So that's the introduction. So I would like to hand over to our keynote speaker, Hugo Slim. Hugo has worked within the humanitarian sector for quite a while now and brings a wealth of experience on the challenges faced, as well as the opportunities for growth in the sector. He is currently a senior research fellow at Blavatnik School of Government in the University of Oxford. We should have time for a couple of questions for Hugo after his presentation. If you have any questions, do please put them in the chat. So over to you, Hugo.
Lisa, thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon to everyone, wherever you all are. And it's a great pleasure to be here and to be invited. Although I'm really not an expert on security at all, as anyone will tell you, but Lisa and others have asked me to give a sort of big picture on the global security scene in which you are operating humanitarian security. So I'll try and give that big picture. I thought I'd start though by remembering, why we're here, why we get up every day, if we're in the security, humanitarian security business, and that is to protect humanitarian workers. And so just to remind as we start that key figure from 2019, that 125 humanitarian workers were killed in 2019, and that 404 were very seriously and directly affected. And these people were killed or affected by shootings, by increasing numbers of aerial bombings, bombardment, artillery bombing, and they were kidnapped as well. And many hundreds more faced probably unreported assaults and security situations of many different kinds. And of course, many people do humanitarian work living with fear. And the other big figure we need to have in mind is that 94% of those people affected were national humanitarian workers. So as I said, I'm not really best placed to talk about security. I've lived a very safe humanitarian life, mostly in libraries, which are quite safe. So I haven't experienced much of this myself. And I've had quite a long humanitarian life as well. So I started in the 80s, and thinking back to security, humanitarian security in the 1980s, it was very informal. It was rather an oral culture. When I went off to work in my first war zone, I got an oral briefing, I got told things to do and not to do, and that was about it, and use your brain. And that was the state of it, rather oral. But of course, then with the war in Somalia and then the war in Bosnia in the 90s, the security situation stepped up and the field began to professionalize. So that's when you and your ancestors in humanitarian security appeared. And I remember the first manual I read was Mark Kutz's Safety First manual in 2001, which he did for Save the Children. But today you are a highly developed and highly professional class of humanitarian worker and many dedicated specialists. So the big picture, I'm going to try and do three things. I'm going to try and look at the geopolitics of security today. Then I'm going to look at your humanitarian space and footprint in that geopolitical world. And then I'm going to finish with a bit of ethics. So first, geopolitics of security today. I'm going to emphasize great powers, big war, authoritarianism, and endemic violence. So if I talk first about great powers, the multipolar world is here. So many of us, and certainly me, we've spent the last 30 years largely in an American world, in US hegemony. That time is over now, that unassumed liberal order and leadership. And we now, in a much more normal political world, which has persisted for thousands of years before, which is the world of great powers, of, if you like, competing empires, of giants who are rivals across the global space and who each have, hold, and extend their spheres of influence geopolitically. And you are mostly at this moment working in small, militarily small wars. And it seems a hard thing to say when so many people suffer, but these are militarily small. They're largely insurgency and counterinsurgency, and often deeply asymmetric. So some powers have air power, computerized technology. They can hit from the air, from the sea, from thousands of miles away. Others don't and have rifles and RPGs, etc. That's your typical habitat and has been for the last 20 years or so. I hope you'll stay there. But that is not the war that great powers are preparing for. They are preparing now for big war. All their military doctrines, whether it's Chinese, US, Russian, NATO, India, are preparing for peer-to-peer warfare, near-peer warfare, where they expect to have major clashes with equal power levels. And you're largely working in parts of Africa and West Asia, the Middle East, and a bit in Myanmar at the moment. Great powers are not so much strategically focused on those places. Great powers are thinking about trigger points to big war. Ukraine, Taiwan, Indian-China border, the whole new term we've got now, just as the Americans invented the phrase Middle East at the beginning of the 20th century, they've now coined this term, the Indo-Pacific. So people are focused much more along the Indo-Pacific and South China Sea in places. If big war comes, and what the big powers are preparing for actually triggered, then your world will be massively different. You will have massive military casualties, you'll have massive civilian casualties, and the geographical space across which war ranges will be huge again. And of course, it'll be all domains: outer space, cyberspace, naval, military, land, etc. But at the moment, all great powers want to avoid that big clash. And so they are preferring what they're calling sub-threshold warfare, hybrid warfare, where they try and contest with each other just under the threshold of a major war. So they're trying to destabilize, encroach, test, trade, hold areas, and uncouple from each other in various ways. And therefore you have the Russians using sub-threshold warfare to take the Crimea, to hold Syria, and you have the Chinese taking Hong Kong recently, taking back Hong Kong. And we'll see what happens in Myanmar, whether the Chinese and the Russians decide to hold that space and exclude Western power from there as well. And the West, meanwhile, is desperately trying to hold Yemen. So these is the sort of geopolitics. The other big trend I want to point out is the rise of authoritarianism and the regrouping of democracy. This is another big geopolitical fact for us all. So we're seeing authoritarianism rising across Southeast Asia, across India, Brazil, parts of Africa like Uganda and Rwanda and other countries. And we are seeing democracy deciding and struggling to regroup in a democratic core, surrounded in a way nowadays by an authoritarian majority that is not persuaded by liberal democracy, not interested in it. Places like China and Russia, they think it's the best way for them to be and create order in the world. But at the same time, many of those very authoritarian states have a very young, democratically aspiring demography. So within those states, there is a tension around dissent and democratic authoritarian tension, almost intergenerational, as we see in Myanmar, and we've seen in other places, a bit in Russia and places. So that tension will also go on being part of the global security environment. And that leads to my last point on geopolitics, is that war creates a lot of suffering, but in a sense, political violence, armed violence, is much more endemic than war across the world. And you might look at recent figures and say maybe 70,000 people are killed violently in war a year, but that compares to 600,000 people who are killed violently in other ways. And whole parts of the world are existing in warlike conditions, places like Central America, increasingly, sadly, parts of Nigeria, and even Pakistan. And that means that the state has often lost its monopoly of violence. So it's not the major violent or force in that area, but others are arising for criminal, political, other reasons, economic reasons. And we're probably increasingly going to see more and more mass protests around the world as well, as we have done. So that may also become a security environment for you as humanitarians. So now moving on to your humanitarian footprint and the space you have. Where are you? Where can you go in the world? And we talk about the international system, the international humanitarian system. And yes, it has many states involved in it, but you're not a global system. And you're not in China, and you're not in Russia, and you're not in India. You're not going to be in the USA. And you're not very much in Southeast Asia anymore, where over the last 10 years, governments have rightly decided we want to be sovereign humanitarian powers in a sense and run our own relief. So you're increasingly out of Southeast Asia as well. And you are the Western humanitarian system. And you are financed and designed by largely OECD states who in UN terms constitute the Western group, the WEOG group. That's the system you are. And so your footprint is and will be mainly in the sphere of Western influence. And the big open question for us all in the next few years is China. And now that China has taken its rightful place as a global power in the world, how much will China finance your system? And how much, in fact, will it decide to replace your system across its sphere of influence, the Belt and Road Initiative, etc., and replace it with internationalizing the Chinese Red Cross and making the Chinese Red Cross a major global humanitarian player in its sphere of influence, or the Chinese Civil Defense Organization? How much will it decide to play that down the Belt and Road Initiative and area of influence? And this all means that you don't have a big patch, and your patch will get smaller. And this makes localization much, much more important for you. If you want global reach, you must localize, find ways of partnering, working with systems and structures that are creating new alternative government grassroots humanitarian capacity around the world. The second thing about your footprint, of course, and you know this very well, much better than me, is that it's not just physical. So your footprint is physical and digital. And your physical and digital space are joined together. So like even me, you know, I live with this phone and we live integrated in physical and digital space. So my digital body tells people where my physical body is. And I do a lot, like now on this Zoom, through my digital body and in digital space. And that creates a huge new security zone for you as humanitarian security workers. You've got this extraordinary, exponentially large new space to protect, to operate, to keep safe, and to keep working. And it's not just misinformation, disinformation, whatever, it's attacks against you and the ability of attacks against individual civilians you're trying to protect, finding out things about them, etc. And the last thing I want to talk about in your space is the nexus. So you are in this dominant Nexi policy being asked to work more and more in tandem with development and peace organizations, not particularly development actors, international finance institutions, World Bank, Asian Development Bank. And they have very different cultures, and they have very different risk cultures and security cultures. Usually, traditionally, they used to leave when danger and war and violence came to town. Now they're committed to staying, but they have a different security culture to you. And we've seen this in Tigray most recently, which I was reading the Humanitarian Outcomes report, that in a sense, part of the slow start in Tigray was because the majority of agencies there were developmental, and they didn't feel comfortable moving into a war, and they didn't have some of the skill sets that you have. So finally, I just want to say three little things about ethics and security and ethics. And the first thing is about prioritizing our people. And I think that's the right thing to do, prioritize the people in our organization. I believe, as in my view of ethics, that there are circles of obligations, and those circles are expanding circles. And the most immediate circle of obligation we have is to those who are closest to us, our staff, our people, the people in our organizations. So our first duties in security are to those who are close to us. And that's why it's right to prioritize the protection of our people. Second thing I want to say is that security should have an ethics of enabling people. Risking lives in a crisis is a person's choice. And if it is in your country, if you are a Syrian like Fadi, who you'll listen to, or if you're a Nigerian, or if you're British like me, and crisis and disaster and war and conflict comes to your country, affects your families, you want to help. And your calculus about risking your life becomes dramatically different. So we should not be infantilizing people in national organizations, local organizations, and saying, oh no, they shouldn't take the risk, we shouldn't pass the risk on to them. They want to take a risk in the interests of their people. They are in a different form of risk-taking, very often to international staff. But the other ethical point is that all decisions around security should be made with people, with staff, and they should be grounded in consent, not coercion. So we can't force people to do things. It's not the army. We have to get informed consent about the risks involved. And if people want to take those risks, which is fantastic if they do, we support them to do so with the protection we can offer. So we have an equal duty of care as well, that we all know very well, between national, international, and local staff in our organizations. We have an equal duty to care for them. And our security posture should be about protecting them and letting them go and work for their people and not holding them back unduly. And the third thing I want to raise about ethics is what I've been calling recently humanitarian resistance. I think in your operating environment in the years ahead, you may see increasing mass protests, oppositional anti-government movements arising. And those movements in resisting authoritarianism will be trying to save lives as well. And we're seeing this in Myanmar at the moment and several other places. And they will be working against the government, often clandestinely, secretly, covertly, in small networks, organized, but part of that will be life-saving. And sometimes resistance is an ethical and political duty for us and for people. But it carries extreme risks, and it's a very different security environment to the transparent, principled, neutral humanitarianism that you have been largely used to. But there may come a point when you are asked to support remotely, closely, people who are working in humanitarian resistance, and that will be a whole new security skill set for you. So I'm going to stop there, and I hope I've given a bit of big picture by talking about geopolitics, the humanitarian space as I see it, and a bit of ethics. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Hugo, for a very interesting speech. So I've just seen a question come in. Okay, that's not a question, that was a statement. So we do have one question that we have had. You talk about the sort of the nexus and the different approaches that the humanitarian development, peace building have towards security. If we think about the humanitarian approach with acceptance being built on the humanitarian principles of impartiality and neutrality, what impact do you think that sort of nexus might have on the perception of the people that we're working with, the communities we're working with, on humanitarian organizations and our ability to maintain acceptance?
That's a great question. It depends, of course, it depends on what the development bit of the Nexus is doing. If it is working very closely to build up businesses and infrastructure for an unpopular government or a government at war with other groups, then it may be perceived as very aligned with one party, and that will give you problems. But if in fact it's heavily invested in developing public goods, which can be part of the humanitarian operation, like water infrastructure, sewage, health, education, then I think you're much less likely to have a friction in the nexus. So I think it depends.
As so much that we do, it's all context specific. Thank you very much, Hugo. Hugo is staying for the panel discussion, so there will be an opportunity to ask more questions and to hear from him again later in the session. But for now, what I'd like to do is move on to the section on security risk management, what it looks like now in the humanitarian sector and where it might go in the future. And we'll start with a short poll we would like you to complete. The aim of the poll is to understand perceptions around security risk management. So most of the questions, there is not a right or wrong answer. It's just so we can sort of understand what the views are. So I will ask Laura to launch the poll, and we'll give you a couple of minutes to complete it. If any of you are having troubles accessing it or anything, do please reach out to the production in the chat. Okay, so as people finish completing the poll, I would like to introduce Christine Perceau, who will give a short presentation on the evolution of security risk management in the aid sector. While working as a consultant, Christine has many years of experience working with NGOs and the Red Cross within the humanitarian response. And she has worked closely with GISF on a number of projects in the past and is the author of our paper on gender and security. Over to you, Christine.
Thank you. I'm just going to pull up something very quickly. Okay. I'm not as gifted in my my producing capabilities. Perfect. So hi everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you this morning here. Again, I also don't consider myself completely a security expert by no means, but certainly there's so much to learn and so much to adapt to. Very quickly, many of you are working in security risk management that are attending this morning, but we're also lucky to have many people that maybe it's new or they've been given this responsibility, but at the end of the day, the most important thing to consider is that it's not about being risk averse. It is all about understanding the internal context of us as organizations, as the people that are part of our organization, how we work, what we're trying to do, the external context, what are those threats, where we're working, and our vulnerability to those threats, and then developing the right measures, again, so that we can access the people that need the assistance and support. So really, that was just a quick slide, and by no means this is a very cursory presentation, but as Hugo had mentioned, certainly before there were some measures in place. Maybe they were communicated verbally. Maybe we did get a small, small document with rules and regulations. But certainly by the mid-90s, early 2000s, we saw more and more of the professionalization or collaboration around looking at security training frameworks. We had the GPR8 in 2000, the 2 ECHO publications in 2004 that were extremely helpful and helped guide us along the way. We did, however, also see many people coming with dedicated positions or outsourcing security to private security providers, having a bit more of a former military or former police profile, which wasn't all bad, because with that obviously came a lot of technical capabilities and insights. But then moving towards when we started discussing around minimum standards, and that also created this reaction of just attaining the minimum, which is not what we should have done. It should have been about attaining more. But in the least, we would see a lot of organizations use a checkbox approach to making sure certain things were done, to now, and this is where we really want to focus, is where is it going now? And it's not just one thing, it's a combination of everything. We do need some of the technical, more rigid safety and security approaches, depending where we're working. We do need standards to attain, and as that relates to duty of care, but we also need, and this is where there's these incredible opportunities, is to really maximize that listening, that recognition of diversity and having diverse personnel in security risk management and influencing security risk management, so that we also take and consider, again, the whole person and what that person-centered approach. And this is more than looking at the intersectional profile. It's really looking at ways, how do we engage? How does our approach and our culture of security risk management help people identify with it, and with it knowing themselves, but also how to work safely, and that we can adjust all of our principles of security risk management principles, but practices based on, again, and then attaining those objectives, but having the person and that conversation, as was mentioned before, those exchanges, those consultations and input. So really, this is very quick, just looking at, you know, how it's gone from a perception of more rigid, which again, some of it, you know, again, there's different types of leadership styles that come into place, but definitely working towards more of that people-centered and consultative approach. So if I was going to think about, well, what are those competencies? And I think this is a conversation we often had, is looking from management to leadership. And that these competencies, again, are not only a certain person with the security risk management responsibilities, but it is cross-cutting. It is almost every function of an organization should have different competencies that are identified and that work together, from HR to the security risk team to, could be, and definitely programming, working together and exchanging within an organization and with other organizations as well. So this is really a quick snapshot of where we're looking at security risk management and how it's kind of flowed through how we've experienced it in the past, I would say 20, 30 years.
That's great. Thank you very much, Christine. And I think that provides us with a foundation as we move into the panel discussion. But just before we go into the panel discussion, I'll ask Laura to share the results of the poll. Just have a quick look of what people said. So question 1. So we have 35% of the participants whose primary role is security risk management, which is great because it means 65% of you don't have that as your primary function. And this is really what we wanted to use this session as an opportunity to share and learn across different groups within the sector. This whole question around, you know, what is the primary function? And it's interesting that between keeping staff safe and enabling program delivery, I think this was part of what Hugo was talking about as well, that there's no point in keeping our staff safe if they're unable to deliver programs. And we really need to make sure that that is what we're aiming for, is to enable program delivery. Good to see the majority thinking about, you know, risk management at that assessment stage. We often fall into a lot of problems where security risk management is only considered when it comes to implementation. The costs for security risk management, that's always an interesting one, because there is no clear-cut answer at the moment on this, and it is something we'll sort of unpack further with Fergus as part of the panel discussion. Question 5, where should the responsibility lie? Again, different organizations, different approaches. And I think this is, as Christine was talking about, that person-centered approach, this applies to the organization approach as well. And really recognizing that there isn't one size fits all for every organization. Question on safeguarding. Interesting to see, you know, the majority, a strong majority, saying that security should be involved. Again, different organizations approach it in different ways, but I think it is something as security managers, we have to get much better at understanding the safeguarding issues, understanding internal threats within the organization, and bringing those into sort of the mitigation processes that we undertake. Personal factors that have most impact. Gender by a small amount. When we ran this session yesterday, so this is a repeat, was very much ethnicity. So again, very individual responses, context appropriate, and something that we need to bear in mind when we're designing our systems. Organizational impact, the organizational culture. As majority, only just. And again, that's interesting. That's the hardest thing to achieve. So I think really gives us some ideas about what we should be focusing efforts on to make the greatest change. Context factor, knowledge and understanding of the context. Yeah, very much interesting. Again, something for us to consider when we're thinking about how do we improve the way that we engage as security managers with the broader sector. Okay, the final question, which departments? My answer to that is it should have been yes in all of them. Again, interesting where different parts think, you know, greater involvement than others. And again, advocacy scores the lowest, which is really interesting because at the moment there's some big global campaigns going on around the protection of aid workers, where we really need to work very closely between security and advocacy to get something sort of valuable and substantive out of the work being done. So thank you for that. So at that point, we will move into our panel, and very happy to welcome our other speakers. So we have Fadi Halisso. Fadi has been one of the main contributors to the work GISF is doing on security risk management with local partner organizations, and is fortunately very willing to stand up and speak on behalf of local organizations. And also we're joined by Fergus Thomas. Fergus is a humanitarian who now works in the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and is a strong advocate for ensuring that the importance of security risk management in humanitarian response is recognised by donors. So again, I have a few questions. If you have other questions that you would like to ask to the panel, do please put them in the chat. I'd like to address the first question to Fadi. So Christine gave us an overview of security risk management in the humanitarian sector. There's often a perception that risk management is for INGOs and international staff only. National staff often consider the rules to be too onerous or not context specific enough for them. And internationals often assume that national colleagues know the country so well that they will not be at risk. This difference seems to be even more stark when there is a local partner organisation and risk transfer is seen as an acceptable way for the INGOs to manage their risks. So working for a national organisation in Lebanon and Syria, how do you see the issue of security risks in humanitarian response?
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for having me. Yes, indeed, from a local perspective, I think security management seems something strange, sometimes coming from another planet. Sometimes it seems engulfed with a lot of hypocrisy. On one hand, there is stress on the need for policies and procedures to follow up in security. But when things get really bad, we see that if these policies are applicable only for the international partners, international organizations, when things got bad in Syria, the international organizations withdrew their staff from the northern parts of Syria when ISIS and Nusra Front took over. It is true that we were happy, our colleagues were happy to face the risk because they were serving their countrymen, their people, their families most of the time. But again, we were disappointed to the lack of support we received to deal with these threats and protect our staff members. Oftentimes, we had to negotiate very hard and for months to even compensate the families of those who lost their lives while doing their jobs. Because it is not budgeted, because we are dealt with as subcontractors who just do the task without any real consideration, even not any share of overhead. So the same goes to other risks like financial risk coming from the banking sectors and counterterrorism legislations. Often local organizations are left alone to deal with those risks. Everyone knows that for banks in the region, they are sensitive toward the word Syria. So until now, we find, and our even partner organizations in Syria find that they receive transfers with the name of Syria from international donors, although they know that their accounts might be closed and it would be like impossible to reopen one. The same whenever the policies of the surrounding countries change towards the hospitality and receiving Syrians and even NGOs in general. We have seen this in the countries around Syria. NGOs are fined with huge fines, and so internationals can pay them, can withdraw their staff. They have their embassies to back them up if anything wrong happens, while Syrians face the risk of being deported to Syria or imprisoned or having a big fine that they cannot afford and might shut down their organizations. Just one recent example from Lebanon. A year ago, Lebanon witnessed a financial collapse, and this led to a lot of organizations losing hundreds of thousands of US dollars in their bank accounts. And no one stepped up to help us. So we had to take all of this risk on our own, take it from our beneficiaries and from our staff salaries. When people in Syria who were forced to displace from Ghouta, for instance, it was very difficult to negotiate with our donors and partners a compensation for them to relocate and resettle elsewhere. So I think there is a lot of talk in this sector about what we should do, but in practice, it is not combined with concrete action to support local organizations. We don't have enough resources to implement our project. So we don't think about budgeting, security management, because this is a luxury we cannot afford. When we are stretched thin on our resources, this is something a real luxury. And I think the challenge here is has multiple dimensions, and the same thing that is not happening on the localization agenda is not happening here on the security management unless there is a will to support local organization honestly and concretely and with concrete action. The localization agenda since the World Summit in Istanbul, World Humanitarian Summit, didn't advance that much in terms of financing the local organizations directly. Until now, when we talk to UN agencies or even donor governments, the one thing we get is that you are too small to handle big budgets. But if we don't have big budget, we don't get to grow up. We don't get to scale up to even have new departments, have new people responsible for security and better finances. So it is a vicious circle, and sometimes this word that you don't have the capacity seems like an endless game. You don't graduate from this capacity building school, however long years you spend there. Today, I'm talking about my organization. Today we are an organization working in 4 countries with 500 employees and a budget of $10 million per year. But still, when we go to, it was impossible to knock on the doors of DFID or SDC or GIZ or BMZ directly without the third-party intermediary INGO. So for us, we still count on our own efforts of fundraising to build up ourselves internally, build our department one by one, brick by brick after 10 years. Even when we get international recognition, we are just won and with a consortium, an international prize that will be announced next month of millions. I think that doesn't change much. We are still here in Lebanon. We have a big school about to shut down because of lack of funding. And when we go to UN agencies, it is the same mantra we hear. So I believe this is a real challenge that won't change just by having conferences and after conference. Lisa, I've been this year, this might be the 4th or 5th event I talk about risk management. And it is nice to see it as trendy as it is, because it is an important issue. We as Syrians are suffering enough from risks in Syria. Every day we have people being killed. Just last month, a hospital in Idlib was bombarded by airplanes, even though it was funded by the UN and bunkered and part of the demilitarization scheme and deconflicting scheme. So it is nice to have all of these conferences and these trendy expressions, but it would be better if we see concrete action, political decisions on the highest levels among donors to focus on building real cooperation, starting a real dialogue, not just events where we tap on each other's shoulders, satisfied with what we have achieved, and to bring this new trendy concept to a highlight, but to really make a progress where we start partnerships, engage in dialogue, and achieve progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fadi, and thank you for that very honest reflection. And I think that call for action, that need to move beyond rhetoric and actually make change is part of what we're hoping to achieve through the sessions at HNPW, and really looking at what are the practical steps we can take to move forward. So Christine, a question to you. I mean, Fadi has really highlighted the specific issues for local organizations, many of which are also applicable to international organizations. What do you see as currently the biggest challenges for effective security risk management in humanitarian response?
I still see some of the big challenges around organizational culture, and I do want to unpack that a bit. What does that mean? Because we say that often, and that it's a complexity at so many levels, again, from the individual and again, the intersectional profile of all individuals within a team. Then we look at management cultures and style, and right to governance. And obviously all of this tested in the external context. So I still see that how is safety and security understood within all of these levels is definitely one of the challenges. Definitely access is an issue, given all of the cross-cutting considerations and in different contexts that we work, just the different types of violences, the complexity, the proliferation of different actors and their different profiles, etc. So that is definitely, so again, even getting further, what we call that last mile, and how we put our principles into practice. So I think those are still, in my opinion, some of the key pieces. And then if we look at some of the opportunities, I absolutely support that important concept of learning and strengthening local capacity if and when appropriate. So again, it's not that transfer, but what we've been using as I've been working with the University of Quebec in Montreal is this collaborative co-construction approach. So really making sure that, and this is work with local implementing partners, that you know, we listen to their needs. We can provide any tools, but there's also incredible resilience and strategies that they're already putting into place. So how do we find that incredible opportunity for co-construction and collaboration? So that's, and then even addressing some of the budgetary issues as you raised, Fadi, absolutely. Because in that listening is sometimes when things have been highlighted that are needed really from a tangible point. So finding these different opportunities. One quick thing, and then we can, I know there's a lot of questions to ask. I know we want checklists and a paper and a toolbox for everything. And I go back to that all of our work and our security risk management practices were always about people and trying to look at all of the different strengths and obviously the vulnerabilities, as that is one of the areas we can try to reduce risk, but also going back to wisdom and experience and all of the important interpersonal relationships or qualities someone would have in when we're looking again at leadership and influence. So I did want to highlight that. And also there were a lot of issues, even if we go back in the history of security risk management, there were a lot of things that were in our view. There were a lot of things that we were trying to signal. Listen, we need to pay attention more to the incidence of sexual violence, for example. We need to, here's the issue of duty of care and what our responsibilities are. But these things didn't surface from, again, a governance level or even more outward level until there was a major incident or scandal that would then accelerate, or circumstances that would then accelerate more development and conversation about that specific issue. So again, I don't, that's not all about, that's not a completely bad thing. Again, it's still a good thing, because then we can advance and work on certain areas. And I think, again, I go back to the notion of localization and where we're heading, and given in that that context, all of the importance around humanity. How we practice not just humanity in our principles and outwardly with the assistance we provide, but internally as organizations, and how we treat our personnel and how we work with others.
Great, thank you very much, Christine. I mean, both Fadi and Christine mentioned this whole issue on resourcing, and here we put Fergus in the hot seat. Organisations often cite the lack of resources, whether national or international, as a significant factor for not implementing effective security risk management. The FCDO has recognised for a while the importance of having a specific budget line for security and proposals, but not all donors do this. If organisations are struggling to get donors to accept security costs, what would your advice to them be?
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks, Christine, as well, for your presentation. And Fadi, you've really hit the nail on the head. This is all coming back to the discussion about letting go of power, right, and localizing responses. So message very, very clearly passed, and I think that's going to be a recurrent theme throughout the HNPW. So with my donor headband on, I think if you look across the ecosystem, possibly the most risk averse, so the kind of polar opposite of what Christine was talking about, risk aversion. We spend most of our time managing risks, and for us, security risk management is really, and on that questionnaire, really is about effective programming. And I think the message should be made really clear to donors that delivering good quality, well thought out security risk management is an important and good value for money thing to do. That if we can manage this very key risk, that we will be able to deliver effective programming. Security is totally unpredictable. Situations are dynamic, fluid, turbulent and violent, but I don't think that security risk management is any of those things. And I think the methodologies that we apply for managing security risks are predictable, and that we can identify and manage and often actually eliminate many risks that we face as we implement operations. But this does need to be resourced, and it needs expertise to do that. But I think the good news story here is that none of this resourcing is very expensive. And I think donors need to understand that they should be allowing their partners to invest. And that's why, after quite a long dialogue actually with GISF about 2 years ago, and quite a lot of discussion about the safety of humanitarians in our parliament, that we made a commitment to allow all of our funded partners to budget for security risk management in their program budgets. So at the lowest level, at the field level, not just in the headquarters indirect costs. I think maybe another point, another recent commitment that we're hoping is going to help, not just with security risk management, but with the localization agenda, is that we're now asking all of our local partners to let me re-explain this. We're asking that all of the funded partners, so the first tier INGOs that we fund, that they would pass on the same or 10% or the same indirect costs to local NGOs in their programming. So that means that local NGO partners can be assured of having a predictable indirect cost budget line in order to manage issues that we take for granted as international INGOs. The problem is that we often, as Fadi pointed out really clearly, create these subcontractor relationships, just dripping money into local organizations. They need predictable funding, just as Oxfam or Save the Children need predictable funding. So this is going to cost us, the donor, more money, but we see this as a really important investment in localization. I'm happy to discuss that more. I think another key part of this is that donors need to think about is looking at the whole ecosystem and supporting niche specialist work like GISF. GISF do so much in convening, in training, in innovating, and they really helped us as well as a donor to think about this decision about allowing partners to pay to have budget for security risk management. They've produced a really good paper on this called The Cost of Security Risk Management. We also do a lot of work with INSO, enabling them to provide their field-based analysis and services in about 15 contexts I think now they work with upward of about 800 different NGOs. So essentially, this is a key part of localization. Security risk management is everybody's responsibility, and the best way to do that is through localization, through adopting acceptance strategies. And I think we're just finding more and more that, that the interventions that are based on building relationships and trust and speaking the language of local communities are the best way to mitigate against the risks of violence against aid workers. And I think that the SRM piece of this needs to be properly resourced. So I would say use FCDO as an example if you must, but be assertive with your donors and ask these questions. Ask them to allow you to fund this work, because you can demonstrate that these interventions not only save lives but deliver effective programming. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you very much, Fergus. We've had a few questions in, a number of them around the issue Hugo raised about the digital and the change in technology. And this has been something in the past we've tended to talk about security risk management as being physical security. We now live in this sort of digital world where the physical and digital security can no longer be separated. So where do you think this is going? And does it sit with security risk management? Does it sit with IT and cybersecurity? What are your thoughts on this and how we might move forward in this digital world? Anyone like to come in on that? Okay, Hugo and then Fergus.
Well, I'll be very quick because Fergus knows more about it than I do. But I would just say, you know, if you ask the same question of the physical, where does the physical sit? You'd say everywhere, because everyone's engaged with the physical world. There's comms, IT, whatever, and it's the same with the digital world. So, you know, it sits with us all because we're all in it, and everything we do as humanitarians has a digital dimension today, more or less. So I think it sits with everyone, but Fergus knows more.
Probably not, but we are thinking much more about the dimensions of the way that digital is playing now into our work, and thinking about digital identity, thinking about data protection. We must deliver the same standards of data protection that we deliver under the EU GDPR in all of the contexts and with all the communities that we work with. So necessarily we must also factor that into our security risk management planning. And that comes back, I think, to the point that Lisa made, that it's everybody's responsibility, and a consultation within your organization that doesn't include the IT people and the data people will mean that you don't have an adequate risk management strategy on this. And that's only going to increase, I think. So I think absolutely, like as Hugo said, I just, you know, can't paraphrase, but increasingly large and increasingly blur between the physical and the virtual world in which we operate. And I think COVID-19 has meant that we are using more and more technologies that are vulnerable to cyber attacks, working remotely. So that's also another factor where we need to consider the risks to be managed in that area. Great, thank you, Fergus. Fadi, Christine, anything you'd like to add on this? I mean, I'll make one comment on this. Is another possible area of discrimination between the national and the international organizations. If you think about the cost of technology and the cost of securing technology, is this something that's achievable? And then when you think about some of the sort of the government positions that Hugo was talking about, is how do we protect the digital in these contexts where governments may be wanting to pry? So I think it's an interesting conversation that we're just at the beginning of. To do a plug, one of the sessions that we have got at HNPW is managing security risks in the digital world. So I'm hoping that we will unpack that issue further there. Another question that we had in, which I think is interesting, is local organizations often have better access, though not always. And with that comes more risk. And I think this is what Fadi and Hugo were talking about, that many are willing to accept that risk, and specifically explain to donors how security is not a concern to them because they have acceptance. But then there is an incident. So how do we balance and predict this? Can we enforce risk management requirements on organizations? Fadi.
Yeah, I think it is dialogue only. We accept the fact that we accept a certain risk is involved in our job doesn't mean that we are willing freely to sacrifice ourselves or our staff members. You know, we need them. We need everyone to be able to do the great job they do. But just let me give you a very quick example we had recently here in Lebanon. Today, we have a big problem with the different exchange rate of the US dollars. So if you take your cash dollars from the bank and exchange them in the black market, it is for 12,000 lira. If you exchange them at the bank, they will give it to you by 50% of the rate, 6,000. So although in our recent distribution after Beirut explosion, we were giving some cash handouts to beneficiaries. So although our policies and a long-term arrangement with our donors meant that no cash, banknote cash is given to beneficiaries for risk issues, we had to put this policy on the side because of the current situation, because we didn't want our beneficiaries to lose 50% of the aid coming to them, to the benefit of the bank who robbed everyone from at the beginnings. It wasn't easy to convince all donors of this. We understand that having banknote cash distribution in our centers in the middle of a financial crisis is a big risk, and we acknowledge that, and we are willing to take the risk for the benefit of our beneficiaries. But if an incident happens, and it will happen, I'm not fooling myself here, then we need to deal with it with our partners and donors and put advanced plans for this when it happens.
Great, thank you. Other thoughts on this question? And I think it sort of goes broader than just the local organizations as well, that balance between security and access. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think running acceptance as a strategy precludes having an adequate security management posture as well. I think you don't just abandon all of the good practices that we have around security risk management because you believe that you are completely safe and you have great relations with all of the interlocutors in the conflict or in a context. So I think you need to still maintain that balance.
Thank you. Christine or Hugo, anything to add on that? Okay, I mean, I think I would just add on that it's something that we made the mistake amongst INGOs for a lot of years that we assumed or presumed acceptance. And I think INGOs are realizing now that they actually have to work on acceptance, but we're now making the same assumption, often on behalf of the local organizations, around that. So I think that is something that we really need to work on. And we have sessions unpacking the sort of the whole building better partnerships and the idea of risk sharing as we throughout the rest of the week. I think just sort of one last question to you all before we move, so quick comments before we move into the group work. How do we break the silos down? What small steps can we take to improve security risk management? We know that major change may be needed, certainly in terms of supporting the local organizations, but what are the small practical steps that we can do now? Christine.
I think, again, it's about if we want to break down those silos and interact with other team members, again, it's our approach. It's how we interact within each other. It's finding those entry points. We used to say this, you could take the security risk management cycle and put it right next to the project cycle or the project life cycle. And there's a lot of areas of overlap and a lot of opportunities there. So those are important from a program perspective, entry points where we can really increase that dialogue together and collaboration. I go back again to some of the best work, best assessments, best proposals, a lot of the best ones were always in collaboration with other team members. The other notion is also looking at, oh, sorry.
Just one.
Say that again?
Just
okay.
Point is
just one? Okay.
Great, thank you, Christine. Fadi. Sorry, you're on mute, Fadi.
I lost the connection for a while when you were asking the question.
So just one, to make a small change, what's one step that we can take, an easy first step we can take? I
believe it should start with a real discussion with decision makers on what they can do, what they can expect, what kind of solution and remedies they expect from local organization. And we can let them know also what is applicable and what is not.
Great, thank you. Yeah, start with the decision makers. Fergus.
Yeah, I think similar. I think what you should do is harass your donors. Open invitation. Because we need to get decision makers buying into this stuff, and we need to get the work happening from the ground. Because if we only have half of that, it's not going to work, I think.
Okay, great. And Hugo.
I'm not best placed because I'm not exactly sure what the silos are in this one, but I think it is all about, in academic jargon, how you frame it. So if you make it everyone's responsibility, if you make it clear that it's, security is actually about the ability to work, then you probably get everyone coming together. If you just say it's called security and it's got a room with a door called security management on it, I think James Brown made this point in the chat, then you're going to ghettoize it. So it's about how you frame it.
I think that's a really good point to move on to the last section. So just before we move on to the group work, thank you very much to our speakers. I think there's been a very interesting discussion. There are questions that we haven't got round to. We will pull them out and develop answers to them with the use of our panel here, and we will put that into a document that we will share through the exhibition site, HNPW. So we will make sure we get round to getting an answer, and we'll pull the conversation that's come out of the chat as well into this. So what we would like to do with the last 15 minutes is to try and get some more input from you on how we might move forward and make security risk management more accessible. If it is by changing what we call it, or what are those other small steps that we can take. So what we'll ask you to do is to join small breakout groups. These will be of around 4 people. And we'd like you, once you are in the group, to consider one question. And I think we can put that up on the slide. So can you please identify at least one action that could improve security risk management in the humanitarian sector? Have a chat about that. And then what we do is we'd like you to put your ideas in the chat when you come back into plenary after we close the groups. Please don't put your ideas into the chat when you're in the group, because that chat can only be seen by the group members and we won't be able to see that. So we'll ask you now to go into the groups and please consider this question and really think about what are the practical things that we can do, that we can encourage, that we can work with in the sector to improve security risk management across the sector. Okay, thank you very much. If you'd like to send people to the breakout rooms. Okay, so the rooms are closed and we have everybody back. So as I say, do please put your points in the chat, because we will sort of gather all of these together. And just some examples, I see there's a few faces I know within the room. Maybe I could ask Radi Hifanawi, sorry, Radi. What did you discuss in your group?
Yes, hello everybody. We, together with Eskadar and James, we talked about the different approaches of security risk management, and we, in fact, we had a very controversial statement.
You're not meant to mention that word.
Yeah, we came with a very controversial statement that our proposal is to ban, in fact, the term security risk management, and make sure that we work more on the behavior and awareness of our staff, and throughout all the organization. So we believe that this term really leads to a lot of confusion. And it's all about also the terminology that we're using. Of course, this is a bit with a wink of the eye, but indeed, the terminology that we are using can sometimes also create a number of aversions with other units or other organizations, or even host governments where we are working, security is not always perceived as neutral, if we use this term. So therefore, we were really looking into the idea of working more on the behavior and the perception of the organization, and put more emphasis on that to increase, in fact, the term that we want to ban, security risk management. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Radi. I think that's a really interesting idea, and particularly as part of the poll, that organizational culture came up as something which had the biggest impact. So thank you, really interesting thoughts. Perhaps we could hear from one of the other groups. Charlotte Aston.
Hey there. Yeah, we had a great discussion initially about talking with donors, but then we raised the point that actually that's not, maybe internal culture needs to change first, so that those that are talking with donors have got that security risk management, or whatever we're calling it, within their minds, that when they're having those discussions with donors, that is brought into that naturally into that discussion, rather than a tick box at the very end. It is part of the whole implementation of the project. And then Dalu was beginning to say, but we didn't have enough time, sadly, that we could talk about. That could be to improve acceptance and access, and how to mitigate conflict, for example, in the implementation of the project. So it's part and parcel of the initial project discussions, rather than an added extra.
Great, thank you very much, Charlotte. And Sandra Levi-Suto, are you there?
Thank you, Elisa, for letting me speak, and everybody, hello. So in our group, we thought like the main thing that came up was about the collaboration, and especially with local partner, and increase also the exchange of information, because we were saying in the previous session that knowledge of the context was very important. We didn't come up with a real way of doing that, but we understood and we agreed that many local NGOs will not, or local actor will not have the same capacity in terms of analysis of the context or the situation. Also that sometimes, you know, security meetings with all the security counterparts for the humanitarian sector were not the place, basically the location where people were really sharing information, like you know, because there is a lot of sensitive information that people are not willing to share. So it's a bit mystified as well. So maybe how to stop that and to improve that. More or less was, yes, collaboration and sharing information. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Some really interesting points for us to work on around language and awareness, and points around integration that Christine brought up. So thank you very much for your inputs, and do keep please adding to the chat if there's anything else that you can think of. So thank you for joining us. As I said, there are other sessions within the integrating security risk management theme over the next couple of weeks. We have this afternoon repeated tomorrow on sharing risks and building stronger partnerships. So this really goes more into what Fadi was talking about, and how do we really share risks rather than transfer risks. On Monday, we have a session around acceptance and access. There was some comments made around that sort of the use of the term access, and it's about enabling programs, and also what does acceptance look like these days in the changing context, and some of the points that Hugo made around where we are in terms of the global geopolitical overview. Then Wednesday, Thursday next week, a session on managing security risks in the digital world. So this will look at how do we cross that border between the physical and the digital, the cyber risks. And the final session on that person-centered approach to security risk management. How do we make sure that it's flexible, that our systems are flexible, that they reflect the individuals, whoever they are within the sector. And I apologize to Andrew, we had all of this worked out before we talked about changing the name. So security still exists in this at the moment, but it is a really interesting conversation to have. And the final session, there is a closed door session on the role of donors. If you are interested in joining that, do reach out to myself or Fergus, and we can arrange an invitation for that. So those are the sessions that we have coming up. You can also find GISF in the exhibition space on the HNPW website. There is a drop-in component, so the stand will be manned. If you want to just come along and have a chat, find out a bit more about the topic or about GISF, you would be very welcome. So finally, just to say goodbye, to say thank you very much to our 4 speakers, to Hugo, Fadi, Christine and Fergus. Their inputs have been very valuable and hopefully really bring in different perspectives to this conversation. Thank you all very much for attending, for participating and for giving your contributions to help shape where we go with this in the future. And finally, thanks to Laura and Megan for all their hard work in producing this, without which any of this wouldn't have been possible. So thank you to them. Enjoy the rest of HNPW, and we hope to see you at other sessions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lisa. Bye.